So let's talk about traditional treatment and what it yields. Levodopa combined with carbidopa, or the gold standard. Carbidopa inhibits the decarboxylation, which prevents the levodopa from being broken down before it reaches the brain. So it's an escort service, if you will. Levodopa has positive effect on motor symptoms with the fewest side effects in the short term. But in the long term, like with so many conditions, sooner or later, it doesn't work so well anymore, and dyskinesia results. There are a lot of side effects of the carbidopa: dizziness, drowsiness, blurred vision, nausea, vomiting, dry mouth, loss of appetite, heartburn, diarrhea, constipation, sneezing, stuffy nose, cough, muscle weakness, muscle numbness and tingling, sleep issues, skin rashes, itching, and headache. Other than that, it's great stuff. But the reason why it's important to focus on this is that in early stage, it is not a bad idea to see if you can stop the progression of this with diet and lifestyle change, treating it as if it's an autoimmune disease, because these drugs are always there and available to treat Parkinson's disease, but maybe not the best first thing to start with. MAO inhibitors, monoamine oxidase breaks down dopamine in the brain, so inhibiting it preserves dopamine. It's used for early stage treatment. A Cochrane review, before Cochrane went to the dark side and started taking money from places it shouldn't. Long story there that we'll save for a different day, but the Cochrane review, which at one time was the gold standard, said that it really did make a difference. There are side effects: dizziness, drowsiness, insomnia, nausea. And the side effects with long-term use become difficult to tolerate, and I have them listed here. So it's also not a plan for a long period of time. Dopamine agonists bind to and activate dopamine receptors, which can delay the start of the drug. In other words, a conventional medical approach is to see if you can delay the start of the drug. So what I'm saying is, if you're going to do that, instead of delaying the start of levodopa and carbidopa, why don't we, with other drugs, why don't we delay the start of any drug by doing the right things and see if we can slow it down? And we've had several instances in which we were able to do that. This strategy can delay the development of dyskinesia, works better in younger patients, but there are adverse events. There are always side effects to drugs. The side effect to the diet is you get better energy and you might delay the onset of disease or reverse it even. But the side effects to drugs are serious, and these are serious: hallucinations, impulse control issues, etc. The best is to use these drugs for patients who have less cognitive damage. I'm not fond of them at all, to be truthful. Anticholinergic agents are not used as first-line drugs because of limited efficacy, and they also have neuropsychiatric effects. They provide relief from tremor in half of patients, but they don't improve other symptoms much at all. And adverse cognitive effects are most common in older patients, and cognitive problems are a symptom of Parkinson's as it progresses. And by the way, one of the reasons to pay attention to that as you're thinking about, are we going to take drugs and which ones, and that sort of thing, is that one of the leading problems, in addition to the physical disability that makes it almost impossible for Parkinson's patients to stay at home, is if they become cognitively dysfunctional enough that you can't leave them alone at all. That's how Alzheimer's patients end up in nursing and care homes and memory homes and that sort of thing, because the family just can't provide 24/7 surveillance, so that the person has to be put someplace else. In terms of what you can look at if drug treatment is the way that this is approached, is control of motor symptoms with drugs will last 4 to 6 years, after which the disease progression accelerates and eventually disability ends up resulting. The younger patients, worse prognosis. If you're going to get this disease, you want to get it when you're older, not younger. You're much more likely to develop motor impairment and dyskinesia and have to live with these types of restrictions for a longer period of time, longer period of disability when you can't really participate in life the way that you want to. Within several months to several years after beginning levodopa, patients develop what's called peak dose dyskinesia, twisting and turning movements, which occur when the levodopa-induced dopamine levels are peaking. Decreased medication can worsen Parkinson motor symptoms. Some patients prefer some dyskinesia to a lower drug dose. the bottom line is by the time you get to this point, there aren't any good options. They're all bad in some way. So you're picking the best of the bad options. And the goal would be to try to avoid that. There are some interventions that are helpful. One is deep brain stimulation, which is implanting of a battery device that provides electrical stimulation to the brain. It can be effective even for people with advanced Parkinson's. It reduces tremor, rigidity, akinesia, and postural instability, and results in lower doses of levodopa, which means that the period of time during which levodopa could be used would be extended. The adverse events are mainly neurocognitive. The result is that you affect surrounding areas of the brain. So it's a difficult decision to make whether or not it's a good idea. Pallidotomy is a surgical procedure that destroys the globus pallidus, which regulates movement. It's overactive in Parkinson's. It does result in significant improvement in some areas, but the risks include cerebral hemorrhage and death. And so it's very important that the patient, a lot of consideration to the risk-benefit ratio. And some, I think, younger patients benefit a whole lot more than older patients. And due to the long period of disability that the person's expected to have, the risk is probably much more worth taking than it would be in an older patient. Thalamotomy is surgical destruction of a part of the thalamus, and it's used for the treatment of incapacitating tremor and rigidity. It's very, very painful. The ideal patient is younger than age 65, has cognition intact, still ambulatory, and doesn't have serious cardiovascular disease, which would be another reason for a Parkinson's patient to change diet. Not only might you be able to avoid all of this stuff, but if you actually did progress to the place where you needed certain types of treatment, you'd be better able to withstand them if your cardiovascular system was in good shape, for example, here. About 3/4 of patients show some improvement. About over half of them, it's significant. It doesn't improve some things, including mental changes. And that, again, is the biggest thing that contributes to burden of these patients on their families. All right, you won't be surprised to hear about this coming from me. A plant-based diet can reduce the risk of Parkinson's disease. In other words, the best thing is to not get this disease in the first place. Many people who come from families where there have been 2 or 3 cases of Parkinson's can avoid it. Your best chance of avoiding it is taking good care of yourself. Diets high in animal fat or cholesterol are associated with a significantly higher risk for PD. Fats from plants do not increase risk significantly. However, that blood-brain barrier that I talked about, that's so important, too much plant fat will cause damage to the blood-brain barrier. The prevalence of Parkinson's disease in places where people eat a much more plant-based diet, we're talking about sub-Saharan, Black Africans, rural Chinese, Japanese, incidence is considerably lower, which tells us that it's not genetics, it's not age, it really is lifestyle. Here are some studies showing that a diet more plant-centered, but even including some fish, can reduce the risk of Parkinson's disease. High intake of fruits, vegetables, fish, legumes, nut, and soy were associated with 25 to 30% lower risk. A case control study in Japan, almost 50% lower risk for Parkinson's disease and people eating a diet high in vegetables, seaweed, legumes, mushrooms, fruit, and fish compared to those that were eating the lowest amount. So when your mother harped on you all throughout your childhood to eat your vegetables, do that, all right? And your legumes and mushrooms and fruit and other plant foods. Again, I've never tried to, I'm a fairly well-known vegan. I like eating a vegan diet. I've never tried to get everybody to do it, first of all, because I can't scientifically support it. But the other thing is that it just isn't, it's easier to get people to convert to a diet that still includes some of this stuff and get them to stick with it. So I'll come back to that a little bit too. And here we are, once again, looking at the dairy issue. Consumption of dairy products and drinking milk can increase the risk of PD. And the risk is independent of calcium intake. It is not calcium that's driving this problem. Brain tissue doesn't regenerate, at least as far as we know. You can do some remapping. That's a different workshop. Maybe I'll do this next year on how you can remap the brain. There's a great psychiatrist in California. He's published a lot of research in this area. But for the most part, brain tissue doesn't regenerate. So the sooner dietary intervention starts, the better the outcomes are. And so we have had the best effect we've had here is working with somebody who has a family member who has been diagnosed with Parkinson's. It's early stage. The person is still somewhat self-sufficient, able to do a lot on their own, and supportive family. And at that stage, it's often the case that we can really draw out the progression or stop it from progressing. But when we get patients who are well down the path of disability, there is a point of no return. And so we prefer for people to do something right away. The high carb diet is best. Carbohydrate increases dopamine production, and through by allowing tyrosine, which is a precursor to dopamine, to pass more easily across the blood-brain barrier and into the cerebrospinal fluid. So the high carbohydrate diet is best, not high protein and not high fat. Animal foods actually have concentrated amounts of amino acids that block the passage of tyrosine. And your plant bases of this particular amino acid are peanuts, almonds, avocados, bananas, lima beans, pumpkin seeds, and sesame seeds. Now, this is just a case report. It reflects one person, but a 75-year-old man with Parkinson's for 8 years had changed to a semi-vegetarian diet for a couple of years, no progression, no increased meds, and improved quality of life. So slowing the progression, you win. Stopping the progression, you win, even if you can't reverse it and go back to normal. And I have not seen that necessarily, but if you can keep it from getting worse. Increasingly in so many areas of our business, we're trying to talk to people about dying with diseases and not from them, all right, and maintaining independence and having a high quality of life. Levodopa is taken orally. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. Amino acids from protein use the same carriers, and so they compete for transport. So in this way, a high protein diet can cause you to need increasing amounts of levodopa earlier, higher doses. So if you restrict dietary protein, you may increase the effectiveness of the medication. Lower doses might be needed. Maybe none would be needed in some cases. Patients are sometimes, there's an awareness of this because patients are often told to restrict protein during the day and eat it at night in order to avoid interference with medications. There's no reason to increase protein consumption at any time. This is a discussion that goes way beyond this lecture. We'll be here all night, but it's impossible to not eat enough protein if you're getting enough calories every day. Patients were randomized to eat a plant-based diet or omnivorous diet. Significant reduction in Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, subscore 3, motor performance, and the modified Hain and Yahr staging scale for plant eaters. These data suggest that plant-based diet might be useful in the management of Parkinson's patients by improving their motor performance. All right, so this is not an idea without merit at all. Ketogenic diets have been shown to improve symptoms and outcomes, but this evidence is limited to case reports, and this may be because of the low protein intake. In other words, ketogenic diets are high fat, also low protein, low carb. And there's been a lot of discussion in several areas of diet. One is this intermittent fasting fad. Is it the fact that protein is limited, or is it the eating window? When people eat a ultra low calorie diet, is it the low calorie or is it the protein limitation here? Is it really that the person is in a fasting state to be in ketosis, or is it the low protein intake? One word of caution: I have seen so many people over the years who claim to be eating a ketogenic diet because they're eating a high fat diet. If you are actually going to use a ketogenic diet for treatment, it is imperative that you measure everything you eat and you check your ketones several times throughout the day, particularly in the beginning. So I just one example I'll mention to you is a couple of times, or a couple of examples, where patients with cancer have thought that they were eating a ketogenic diet. Nobody ever told them about the need for it to be so specifically structured. And the cancer progressed because they weren't actually in a state of ketosis. And so it's a big decision to eat a ketogenic diet. It's hard to sustain, and you need to be constantly diligent and vigilant about it. And a lot of people think they're eating a ketogenic diet who really aren't. And I think, based on what I've seen with the Parkinson's patients, that the effect, to the extent that it works, it's protein restriction. And there is another way to get there. Just eat a lower protein diet, okay? And it's easy enough to do on a plant-based diet. So this is our food guide pyramid that has, it's our autoimmune, with an autoimmune addition, right? So some of you have seen this before, and you'll notice at the bottom, 64 ounces of filtered water, maybe more, depends on the person, physical activity and sweating and that sort of thing. I'm a hot yoga fan, so 90 minutes in the hot room, you lose a lot of water, so more water is needed. Legumes, whole grains, you'll notice no brow foods under the whole grains category: barley, rye, oats, and wheat. And it's due to molecular mimicry. And that's a topic that goes beyond how much time we can spend here. But we cut out those foods. And then potatoes, squashes, and corns. Your calorie density comes from these starchy foods right here. Lots of vegetables, lots of fruit, minimally processed grains and cereals and breads and tofu, minimally processed foods. Notice no brown foods here. Higher fat plant foods, we minimize those in the diet. Organic animal foods, 2 to 3 times a week, optional. Don't have to eat them, they're optional. But one of the reasons we've always included them in the diet is, first of all, we can't really find any scientific evidence that says that continuing to include them is a problem, but it's a dose-dependent effect. So if you look at these healthy populations, they're eating a very tiny amount of animal food, which we, arrange in our diet 2 to 3 times a week because it's more suited toward the way that people in our society eat, as opposed to using animal food to season dishes that serve lots of people, and etc. But not required. Okay to give it up too. And then you'll see at the top treats, occasional. And this is where it's okay to have birthday cake on your birthday and a glass of wine on New Year's Eve or something of that nature, but the operant term here is occasional. And we found over 27 years of doing this that if you have a strong personality like mine, you can get people to commit to never eat another cookie and never have another alcoholic beverage and that sort of thing. But in the final analysis, the likelihood that a young person is actually going to follow through on that is about 0. So let's just build it in and do occasional. And sometimes people will get cute with me and say, well, you say holidays and birthdays. What about National Kidney Donor Week? Well, we don't have to get ridiculous about it, right? But, birthdays, when friends are visiting from Australia, that kind of thing. Most of the time, this lecture is taking place on a Monday. I think every day is great. I want to have the best time possible, but it's just Monday. So I'm just eating my plant-based food as reflected in this eating plan here today.